What's going on, you guys? TBR here, back yet again with another Street Fighter Duel video, and in today's video we are going to be piggybacking a little bit off of my very early week 1 tier list for Street Fighter Duel and talking about one specific class in particular with today's video. I figure we're going to be doing this with each one of the classes at some point on this channel. But in today's video, I want to go ahead and talk about a class of characters that a lot of people are discussing right now, and I just want to go ahead and give my 2 cents on this, and that is of course going to be tanks. In today's video, we're going to be going through some of the different tanks in the game, both the classical tanks, like your E-Hondas, your Zangiefs, and of course your Makotos, but then we're also going to be talking about some good budget options, as well as the big red elephant in the room, in the game in general, and that is of course going to be the best tank in the game, best character in the game, and of course that's Bison, right? We all knew that. But before we go ahead and get into all of that and more, make sure if you guys haven't already done so, you smash that like button and subscribe, and let's just go ahead and hop into today's video. So in today's video, I want to go ahead and we're just going to take it section by section. I'm going to talk about each one of these characters that I feel like deserves to be discussed here today, and I'm just going to break down kind of how I feel about each one of them and my experiences with each one of them so far playing Street Fighter Duel, to give you guys at least some sort of an idea on which of the tanks, both the classic tanks and the non-classical tanks, that are going to be worth using in this game. So the first thing we need to, of course, discuss is going to be a character that is not necessarily a classic tank, but is a character that is so broken right now that he ends up just making up for the fact that he's not a classical tank with the fact that he's just that good, and that, of course, is going to be Bison. So the issue with Bison here is, of course, he's not going to be a tank. He's technically going to be a damage dealer. However, you're going to notice that most people at high ranks, including myself, use him as such. The reason for this is because, of course, this character is going to have that really ridiculous, very broken, and almost just game-breaking mechanic where he is going to be able to bring himself back to life and nuke the opposing team as long as there is another friendly fighter on the field. This character is pretty much immortal. He's going to be able to res himself. He's going to be able to tank hits at the front of your line. And overall, we all know why this character is so broken. And it's pretty obvious at this point that this character, if you don't want to invest in some of these other tanks that we're going to be talking about, if you already have him, you almost won't need to at certain points. However, I would like to say that just because you might have M. Bison does not mean that you can just go ahead and ignore all these other tanks. This is a game, and I mentioned this several times in several of my videos. Specifically, I believe I talked about this a little bit in my tier list video. At a certain point, you are going to need each one of the classes of fighters. You are going to need multiple different fighters to swap in and out of your line depending on where you're at in the game and what you're playing. So my recommendation to you guys is not to go too crazy. Definitely use your limit breaking in order to be able to build your roster primarily, because you aren't going to necessarily, especially if you're free to play, have a ton of different resources to throw at building all these different teams. But at the same time, make sure that you do take into account even whether or not you have Bison, because again, he can just be your designated tank and do it just fine. He is going to be the best one you could possibly pick, trust me. You are going to have instances where you're going to want some of these other characters, not just for current content, but going forward in the game. But because this character is so broken and honestly just kind of a cheesy character in general, he is going to be technically the best tank in the game, even though he is not a tank. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is not a classical tank, and we're going to have several characters that we are going to be talking about today that aren't classical tanks. It's just the fact that this guy you have to kind of just start off with, because he pretty much runs the room. He runs the meta right now, at least until something comes into the game that can stop him, right? So that is going to be the first thing I kind of just wanted to get out of the way. So let's go ahead and talk about classical tanks and why some of these classical tanks are so good. And I've seen a lot of people kind of talk about the different tanks in the game, with some people saying that, you know, they live and die and live and breathe off of their tank, and other people that just absolutely don't care about tanks, they don't want to build tanks, they don't care about tanks, they don't see the value in tanks. And I think that those are mainly going to be players that do exactly what we just talked about and just cheese with M Bison, because again, you are going to need your tank. I even with my M Bison still use tanks in this game to get through certain content, and you guys have seen I'm pretty deep into the game at this point. So at this point, I will say that I definitely like to use some of my tanks, even still having M Bison built up. So with that said, let's get into classic tanks, and then we'll talk about kind of budget options as well as non-classical tanks. So there's really going to be three major classical tanks that we're going to talk about here, and I want to start off with E Honda. So E Honda is a very good tank. He is a classical tank. This is going to be a character that has a damage sharing mechanic, which is very nice, but it is going to be capped out at 30%. So this character can damage share, and that means that he's basically going to take some of that damage that your teammates are taking and help you in that regard. However, this is also a character that is going to have some other things that are going to be very nice for him, such as things like Desperation, which increases his damage resist by 30% when with damage immunity during the first 2 seconds. And then he's also going to have something that is really interesting on here. He's going to have his bullet wall. So basically bullet wall, what that's going to do is it's pretty much just going to negate. It's just going to negate ranged attacks. So things like fireballs and etc., he is going to be able to soak those. So this is a character that you're going to notice is very popular right now with people as far as tanks are concerned. However, I've noticed that this is a character that also is kind of a love him or hate him. Some people really like using E Honda, and I can understand why, but then there are also people out there that hate E Honda, and I can also understand why. However, when it comes to the three mechanics that we just talked about, both the damage sharing, the desperation, and the bullet wall, you begin to kind of see why this character is so useful. So if maybe, for instance, you are on a story stage where you're having issues with somebody in maybe the back of that line that is throwing out a bunch of fireballs or ranged attacks, and that is something that is causing you issues and blocking your progression, this is a character that can be very helpful with that. So as a classical tank, E Honda definitely going to be one of the better ones in the game. However, he is not going to be the best tank in the game, at least not in my opinion. We will be talking about her soon. So the next one here is going to be Zangief. Now Zangief is going to be a classical tank as well. This is going to be actually the only taunt tank in the game, which is pretty interesting. So he also is going to have super armor on his kit, which is nice. His DPS is going to be based on his defense, and he is going to be able to stun. So one of the other things that's really cool about this character though is he has this reduction mechanic. So he reduces flame, thunder, or soul damage taken by 20% upon entering battle, and this lasts until the end of the battle. However, if you take a look here at level 4, while Zangief is present, all allies receive 25% flame, thunder, and soul damage reduction, and this expires after the fighter takes a fatal damage. So with that being said, Zangief is kind of a long game tank. This is going to be one of the better tanks in the game in general, period, point blank, if you want to fully invest in him, overbuild him, and get him built up. This is a character that can be absolutely decimating to your opponent. Now, another thing about this character, because he is going to be able to kind of get that DPS from that defense, I would definitely recommend obviously trying to build that defense up on this character, because the longer that this character is on your team, the more you build him up, the more you play around with him, the more that you realize that this is a character that is going to be very, very good, as long as you're willing to build him up fully. Because like I said, being able to get this right here on Red Cyclone is absolutely ridiculous. And this character has so much going for him, between the fact that he also has things to supplement himself, like that super armor and that stun. This character is going to be a very, very good character on your team. And overall, I think that this character is one that you will definitely want to use, as long as you are willing to be able to build him up in the long game, because or after that, that's where this character really starts to shine. And this is one of the characters that I use the most as a tank outside of the next one that we're going to talk about, which in my opinion is the best tank. But another really amazing classical tank, it just comes down to the fact that you have to be able to build this character out fully and kind of max him out in order to get that really, really ridiculous damage out of him for being a tank. Which some of these tanks, that's one of their big downsides being tanks, is they don't do as much damage, which is pretty obvious with the class. Anytime you play, and I try not to be condescending with some of this stuff, like I figure that people know that tanks are pretty much going to be based off things like defense and HP depending on the tank, and that you're not necessarily going to see, you know, assassin style DPS out of a tank, etc. But with this guy right here, if you go in and you invest in him properly and you build him out properly, you're going to get some amazing damage out of him at late game. So let's talk about the best tank right now, arguably in the game. So Makoto. Makoto is the best tank in the game for your classical style tanks. This is going to be another one of the Thunder faction lineup, which they have pretty much all the best tanks right now. That's pretty much goes without saying, just looking at all these characters on paper. Now, when it comes to this character, key focus and key flow are really what makes this character run. So I want to kind of take a look at those. So on key focus, you're increasing your damage by 4% for 30 seconds, which is really, really good. Now, when it comes to this character though, so there's a couple of different things that people don't realize about this character, right? So first and foremost, she is going to be an impressive AoE damage dealer for being a tank. That is one big thing right there. It's because she's getting all these stacks constantly, right? And I talked about in my tier list how good both of these mechanics are between the key flow as well as the fact that she is going to have this key focus. But key flow really is going to be what we need to focus on here, because we're talking about her viability as a tank and why it is considered to be the best. And that is going to be because key flow increases defense by 100 plus 6% for 30 seconds and stacks up to 5 times. So as you guys can see here, she has this on her passive, and this character getting these stacks, it's going to make this character that much tankier throughout the fight, to where eventually, as she's ramping up and she's building up stacks, she's going to not only be able to take more damage and to take more hits, but she's also going to be able to, because of the key focus, deal out more damage. So this is a character that is very, very strong. And again, because she is going to be AoE, this is also a character that's going to be able to output some really nice damage, especially if you're fully investing in her at late game for a tank as well. So that is a really nice addition to her kit, but really she lives and dies off of key flow as a tank. And overall, with this character having the mechanics that she has, I definitely feel like this is the character that if you need a designated full-time tank right now, and you specifically are running Thunder faction, but really if you just need a tank in general, if you're just trying to pick one and your faction might lack a really good one, she's the one that I would really look at. And honestly, the 3 characters that we just went over are going to be, in my opinion, the best 3 classical tanks in the game. It's just that Bison kind of overshadows them, and I really do feel like that's kind of where most people are having this kind of backward idea where they just don't feel like tanks are necessary. It's because Bison's making up for it. So Makoto, in my opinion, as an AoE and a tanker, really, really good. And I think that this is the character that you really should look at if your line is missing just a designated tank and you feel like she would synergize well. I would definitely take a look at her because she is phenomenal. So those are going to be kind of the 3 big classic tanks in the game right now that everybody talks about, that everybody uses from one time to another. And like I said, you're not always going to need a tank, and it's always going to come down to who you have and what you have and where you're at on your account. But if you've been playing this game for a while now, over the course of the past week, then you would know that the tanks are something that you are going to eventually need. So kind of keep that in mind. So those are going to be kind of the big three right now, in my opinion. But I want to talk about some other characters that are non-classical tanks, and we can kind of go from there. So the next one I want to talk about is actually one that I do not have, and that's going to be Beast Zangief. Now, the reason I want to talk about this character, you're going to notice he is a balance type. So this is not going to be a classic tank. This isn't going to be like the previous Zangief that we talked about that is kind of just a classic taunt tank, right? So with that said, though, it is something that could be forgiven if you thought that he was a classic tank. I could see why you would think that, but instead, this character is really going to shine as a speed buffer. And that's kind of what this character's trying to do. He's trying to basically build up speed stacks for his damage reduction for wind fighters, and he also has things like super armor. But you're going to notice here that if you take a look, when the battle begins, each point of extra speed grants the fighter an 0.3% damage reduction. Now this is going to stack up to 30% and last until the battle ends. So if we go through here though, you're going to notice that at level 3, when the battle begins, each point of extra speed grants the fighter and other wind faction teammates a 0.4 to 0.2% damage reduction, and it stacks up to 40 to 20% and lasts until the battle ends. So basically this character at level 3 is going to be able to extend this to the rest of the team, and it really does start to get a little bit crazy when this character is on a well-built, fully designated wind team, because at that point he is going to be pretty much just buffing the team. Now again, he is not a classic tank, but you could definitely try and use him as such. And with the fact that he does have super armor, he has a chance to stun. He has things like bleed on here as well, so he's also going to be able to apply a dot, which this character's damage output as a balanced fighter is also really, really good, especially the higher up you build him. So that's why you see in high ranks a lot of people are using this character, and typically speaking, I've seen him mixed in with other factions, but a lot of times it's just win teams will use him, but you see him quite often, and there's a reason for that. This is a character that can get very out of hand very quickly. It's just the fact that he isn't necessarily a classic tank. And that's something that you're going to have to kind of keep in mind. So that is the next character I wanted to talk about, a non-classical tank, but one of the best non-classical tanks in the entire game right now. And in my opinion, he's definitely one that if you have him, and you're not like me and you don't have him, then you definitely build him up, because he is going to be pretty valuable if you wanted to invest in him, right? So let's talk about another non-classical tank here. And really, when I say non-classical, I mean these characters really aren't necessarily tanks, but they do have things in their kit that can get you by if you don't have a classic style tank, or you're trying to go for more of that hybrid style for certain game modes or for certain chapters, right? So let's talk about Blanca. So Blanca he's not really a tank. He has electric shield, which is really, really good. He has things like super armor on his kit as well. So this is a character that can be kind of a, I don't want to say budget quote unquote tank, because he isn't necessarily a budget character. He is another Thunder Faction character though. Go figure, right? But this is a character that you could use in that style if you really wanted to, because he is going to have the things that we just mentioned. That electric shield can be very, very good, and anybody who's played this character pretty much knows how good he can be. But at the same time, if we're talking about classic tanks versus non-classic tanks and trying to kind of delineate between the different types of tanks that are in this game, then I would definitely put him under a very high up on the ranks of non-classical tanks. But at the same time, I still think if you're looking for a tank, you go for some of those ones we talked about at the beginning. But still, you could use him and you could get by just fine. It's just that it isn't necessarily what he is designed for, right? So the next thing we can go ahead and do here, talk about some more of them. T-Hawk is interesting. So T-Hawk, his biggest problem is he is a resistance-based tank. So if you take a look at this character, he increases defense by 60% for 10 seconds when a debuff is resisted. And you see that this kind of changes over the course of him being leveled up. So level 2 increases defense increased percentage to 80%. Level 3 increases the defense of other teammates by 40% for 10 seconds when the effect triggers. And then at level 4, the trigger interval reduces by 10 seconds. So that's good. The problem with this character is that not all the time are you going to need to be resisting things, and if that is the case, then he almost kind of becomes dead weight. And I hate to say that because he is a good little character, but he's a non-classical tank because he isn't going to necessarily be able to go in there and just soak damage against almost anything. He's going to need to kind of have a right type of matchup, and that's kind of where his downside lies. However, where he does shine, and in the instances where he is useful, you are going to be very happy to have him. But at the same time, overall, having this character on your team isn't necessarily going to make up for the fact that you might lack some of these other tanks. So at the end of the day, things like being able to dispel debuffs from teammates, things like ramping up, like I said, basing off of that resistance, ramping up that debuff, it's nice, but at the same time, it's one of those things where he isn't necessarily going to be useful all the time. And so I really feel like just because of that, he does fall down and tumble down the ranks of tanks. It's kind of an interesting sentence, ranks of tanks. He does tumble down that rank very, very heavily because of that, because he's so conditional. And there's nothing wrong with that. You could say that about certain aspects of any of these characters, but he just seems to suffer from that more than others. And I just feel like that means that he isn't necessarily a character that I would go out of my way for unless you're just really strapped for help in this regard, right? So that's kind of how I'm feeling about him right now. And by no means have I been able to go in and build out and test all these different characters, but I have played a lot of this game so far and seen a lot of people's opinions, both on Discord, Reddit, anywhere you want to talk right now on social media. And really, at the end of the day, I feel like that's kind of where a lot of these characters are sitting this early into the game, which is another important fact because it is still very, very early in the game's lifespan, and things are changing and evolving very, very quickly over time here. So in a month's time, a lot of this might change. So some of the other characters we could talk about here, Hugo, I've seen some people really like this character. He has a shield and he has heals. Really the biggest thing about this character, he's kind of funny. So he's got his potato stacks, which are really funny. Potato, each stack increases the amount of healing received by 4%, and it cannot be dispelled in stacks up to 5 times. So if you take a look at this character, I can see why people really like him. He's kind of gimmicky. He's actually going to be more of an HP based tank, which is interesting as well. So just kind of take that for what you will. His preferred stat at that point would be HP, unlike a Zangief, which would be defense, etc. Which I see a lot of people talk about things like preferred stats, damage or scaling, etc. And just really kind of consider the fact that this game is kind of like any classical style game of its ilk. It's kind of like any RPG style game or any game where you're building out characters. You have classes, you have traits, trees, etc. There's going to be preferred stats for any of these characters based off their specific kit and what they're trying to accomplish. So always kind of keep that in mind, because that does make a huge difference with building your characters. So kind of just knowing what stats build off of what and what effects on what skills build off of what stat is kind of really important for people to know. And it's something that really, honestly, if you played these types of games, you should already know just kind of looking at it. But I can see where if this is maybe your first time playing one of these types of games, that might be something you'd overlook. So I could forgive you for that, but I just wanted to throw that in there as an aside. But overall, this character is a nice little budget tank, but at the same time, I really wouldn't go out of my way with him. I feel like there's going to just be better ones that you're going to unlock over time. So the next one we can go ahead and talk about here is a really budget option. Where are you at? Where is he at? There we go. So Abel here is very popular with people, I have noticed, and there is good reason for that. He has shields that are very, very good at early levels and for a lot of content. My biggest issue with this character, besides the fact that he is going to be a real budget option, let's be honest, is the fact that those shields, while they can come in clutch, they're also pretty short, and so that kind of leaves him and the rest of your team open. He does have a stun on here as well. I will say that this character, if you wanted to build him and you have no other of the top options that we talked about, maybe from just the purely classical tank standpoint, then this would be the next best bet, in my opinion. In fact, he's a character that I would even say, you could say that based on what he's trying to accomplish as far as classical tanks in this game are concerned, he's going to be a character that could honestly rank pretty highly amongst those classical tanks. Now, granted, it's a shallow pool, and some of the characters at the top stand out way above and beyond the characters at the bottom. So there is that thing to consider there. But at the same time, as a character that is going to be able to shield, he is going to, like I said, be able to give you that stun. You're also going to be able to get dodge up, which is another important factor for a character if you're trying to tank, which can be very good as well. I mean, this character does have plenty going on with his kit. However, you also do have to invest in him really highly, especially if you notice right here. Each stack of Wide Eye additionally increases your parry rate by 5% and parry power by 20% of your defense. So Wide Eye, if you guys don't know, gains a 5% defense bonus and a 3% attack bonus for 10 seconds and stacks up to 5 times. You do have to invest in this character pretty heavily in order to be able to get the full breadth of what is going to make him a good little tank in this game. But if you do that, then you will be rewarded. And I do feel like this character, as far as kind of the lower level, kind of just the characters that people would look at as kind of being just bottom of the barrel when it comes to this class, I think that honestly he is the best of them and could definitely be one of, in my opinion, the top 5-ish tanks in the game right now. He isn't necessarily a terrible character, it's just that there are better options, and with this game being so restrictive on things like your resources to build characters right now, I don't really feel like you should go out of your way to build some of these other like real budget options. I feel like you're better off saving those resources for some of the better characters, the top tier characters right now. And characters like I'm talking about Honda, Zangief, Makoto, etc. Those are kind of the ones that I would really try to focus on, because again, you can't afford to invest everything into all these different characters because you are going to run out of resources if you're free to play. So at the end of the day, I feel like you really have to be careful with what you're doing with your resources. And that's why a lot of times with some of these more budget options, I'll be a little bit more dogged about how I feel about them and how I recommend them to people. It's because while I do have an account that has the ability to build up more characters than others, I also understand that I'm kind of in a privileged place with that, whereas others are going to have a much harder time and they're going to have much more limited resources. And I don't want to just recommend all of these characters that you could build, yes, and get usefulness out of, yes, and they be very good, yes, when there's other better characters that you could invest that resource into and not put yourself in a bad spot later on whenever you get to the point where you get strapped for some of these resources, right? So that's kind of my opinion on the classical, non-classical tanks in the game. Pretty much at the end of the day, guys, I don't think there's much debate about it, and I think that any type of debate about it is kind of ridiculous at the end of the day. I think that tanks are very important, just like they're important in any type of game like this, and at the end of the day, you want to be able to know at least kind of what your top handful of tanks are, because there is going to come a point where you're going to be sitting there stuck on some sort of stage, whether it be in the chapters of the story or any of the side missions. You're going to come to a point inevitably where you're going to need a tank, and you're going to want to know who is doing what and who is better at what over others. And at the end of the day, I really do feel like the top 3 options are the first 3 we talked about. And then from there, you can kind of base who you want to build outside of those 3 off of preference, what you need at the time, and kind of what team it is you're trying to end game build right now. And I know there's no end game right now, we're 1 week in, but you know what I mean. The characters that you've decided that you wanted to go in and fully invest on, your main team, quote unquote, who complements them the most. But really, I would focus on the big ones to start off. Again, unless you are a whale and you can just afford to invest in all of these different characters. But anyway, you guys, that's just my opinion on tanks. I know there's a lot of debate on this, and I don't feel like there should be. I feel like tanks are necessary. They're just not necessarily necessary for everything, right? So at the end of the day, it is one of those things where you are going to eventually, like any class, any type, any style of character, you're going to need different things for different content. And so at the end of the day, that's kind of where that's at. So I've said at the end of the day at least 5 times here in the last 2 minutes, so I'm just going to go ahead and get out of here. You guys can let me know in the comment section down below what you think about all this. Who are your favorite tanks? Because just like I said in the tier list video, largely a lot of this stuff just comes down to personal opinion and really what your experiences are with the game, which, hey, if you're playing the game, you're enjoying the game, your experience with a certain character is more positive than you might hear from somebody else on Discord, Reddit, Facebook, YouTube, whatever the case, then hey, your prerogative. You play the game the way you want to play the game. If it is working for you, then it works for you. The nice thing about this game right now, and I get the feeling I've read this comment several times, not just on my videos, but I've seen them across the internet. The reason why there's so many wildly varying opinions on so many characters is because it just goes to show there's so many different combinations and viabilities that go along with all these different characters that it kind of shows a good balance right now. And while certain characters like, you know, this guy right here might laugh in the face of all of that, at the same time, this game does have a lot of variance and a lot of variety, and that is a great thing. But anyway, you guys, that's just my opinion. Let me know yours in the comment section down below. Like, share, and subscribe on your way out. And until the next one, you all take care. Peace.